The moment my brother said those words, I didn't flinch. I didn't cry, I didn't even look up from the table. She has no idea what she's doing, she never did. She's been riding on our family's name her whole life and calling it success. He said it loud enough for the whole conference room to hear, loud enough for the 12 people sitting round that mahogany table to turn and look at me, loud enough for the senior partner from Hargrove and Wells, the firm we were all gathered to negotiate with, to shift uncomfortably in his chair. I took a slow sip of my coffee, set the cup down, and said nothing. What my brother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Let me take you back. My father built Caldwell Property Group from scratch. 23 years, starting with a single duplex in Columbus, Ohio, and ending with a portfolio worth just over $40 million, commercial buildings, residential complexes, a few mixed-use developments across the Midwest. He was the kind of man who knew every tenant by name, who showed up to fix a broken furnace himself at 2 in the morning rather than wait for a contractor. He was methodical, patient, honest in a way that made people trust him with their life savings. He died 18 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to burial. My name is Hadley. I'm 31. I'm the youngest of 3 and the only daughter. My father and I talked every Sunday without exception, even when I was living in Chicago for grad school, even when I was working 80-hour weeks at my first job in commercial real estate finance. He used to say I had the instincts of a developer and the discipline of an accountant, and that was the rarest combination he'd ever seen. What he never said, at least not out loud, not to the others, was what was written in the trust documents he'd spent 2 years preparing before he got sick. My oldest brother Gordon is 40. He managed the family's property management division for the last decade, which mostly meant he collected the rents his father's buildings generated while taking a salary that would make a mid-level bank executive blush. He's charming at dinner parties. He has strong opinions about whiskey and golf handicaps. He also has a habit of making decisions with other people's money and calling it initiative. My other brother, Philip, is 36. He's smarter than Gordon, but more dangerous because of it. He worked as the company's in-house counsel, which meant he knew exactly how to structure things to protect himself when they went sideways. He once renegotiated a vendor contract so badly that my father paid out a settlement quietly just to make it go away. When I asked my father about it afterward, he just shook his head and said, "Some lessons you can't teach. They have to learn it themselves." I don't think either of them ever considered that I was a threat. Which is exactly what I needed. 3 months before my father passed, he asked me to come home to Columbus for a weekend. He didn't tell my brothers. He sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a manila folder and walked me through everything. The trust structure, the asset breakdown, the succession plan he'd worked out with his estate attorney, a woman named Gail Marsh out of a boutique firm in Dublin, Ohio, who specialized in exactly this kind of family business transition. He'd structured the trust so that all 3 of us received equal distributions from the income-producing assets. That part was fair, and he wanted it to be, but control of the operating company, the entity that actually made decisions about acquisitions, dispositions, capital improvements, leasing strategy, that controlling interest was placed in a separate LLC. He gave me 51% of it. "Gordon will fight it," he said. He wasn't upset about it. He was just being accurate, I know. "Philip will find a legal angle, he always does." I know that too. He looked at me for a long moment. "You're ready." I didn't feel ready. I didn't feel ready. I felt terrified. But I knew what he saw when he looked at me, and I wasn't going to let him down. He died 6 weeks later. The first 6 months after the funeral, I stayed quiet. I came back to Columbus, I took an office in the Caldwell building on 5th Avenue, and I started going through everything, every lease, every loan covenant, every maintenance deferral Gordon had approved over the years to keep the cash distributions high, every contract Philip had drafted that had a clause in it that subtly benefited himself. What I found was not pretty. Gordon had been pulling a management fee on top of his salary, a fee that wasn't disclosed to the other beneficial interest holders under the trust. It wasn't technically theft, but it was the kind of thing that gets lawyers very interested when it surfaces in the wrong room. Philip had structured his own legal services contract with the company so that he couldn't be removed without triggering a severance payment of $400,000. He'd had my father sign it 2 years earlier, during a busy stretch when my father was focused on a major acquisition. My father probably didn't read every line. That was the only time in his life I'm aware of that he didn't. I documented everything. I said nothing. I also did something else. Over those 6 months, I quietly reached out to Hargrove and Wells, one of the largest commercial real estate development groups in the Midwest, headquartered in Indianapolis. They had been circling the Caldwell portfolio for years, hoping my father might eventually sell. I wasn't going to sell. What I wanted was a joint venture, a partnership structure that would bring in institutional capital to fund the next phase of growth while keeping the Caldwell name and operational control intact. I spent 4 months negotiating the terms. When the term sheet was finalized, it valued the operating company at $62 million. I told my brothers there was a meeting. I said a potential strategic partner wanted to discuss a relationship with the company. I gave them a time and an address and nothing else. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, floor-to-ceiling windows, a long table that could seat 20. The Hargrove and Wells team was already there when I arrived. 5 people, including their CFO and their head of acquisitions. I knew all of them. I had been working with them for months. Gordon walked in 3 minutes late, which was on brand. He was wearing a blazer that cost more than my first car. He shook hands around the room with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been held accountable for anything. Philip came in right behind him. He clocked the Hargrove and Wells people immediately, and I could see him doing the math, trying to figure out what this was before anyone said a word. I waited until they were seated. Then I opened the meeting. I explained who Hargrove and Wells was. I explained the joint venture structure. I walked through the key terms, and then I told them that I had already executed the letter of intent on behalf of Caldwell Property Group in my capacity as the controlling interest holder of the operating LLC. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Gordon broke it first. "What do you mean you already signed?" "I mean the letter of intent has been executed. We're moving into due diligence. You can't do that unilaterally. This is a family company. It's a company with a defined governance structure, Gordon. I hold controlling interest. I have the authority." He looked at Philip. Philip's jaw was tight. He was already thinking. Then Gordon said it. "And I want you to understand." He didn't lower his voice. He didn't pull me aside. He said it in front of the Hargrove and Wells CFO, in front of their head of acquisitions, in front of all 5 of them. "She has no idea what she's doing. She never did. She's been riding on her family's name her whole life and calling it success. She has no business being in this room, let alone signing anything on behalf of this company. She's in over her head, and she's about to blow up everything our father built." I took a sip of my coffee. I set the cup down. I said nothing. What happened in the next 4 minutes is something I've replayed many times since. The senior partner from Hargrove and Wells, a man named Tom Garvey, who had been in commercial real estate for 30 years and had the kind of calm that only comes from having seen everything, leaned forward slightly in his chair. He looked at Gordon, not unkindly, just directly. "Are you familiar with the transaction history she's developed with our team over the last 4 months?" Gordon blinked. "What transaction history?" "Ms. Caldwell has been the sole point of contact for this deal since August. She provided the full asset-level financials, the operating history, the environmental reports, the title work. She identified 3 structural issues in the portfolio that your company hadn't flagged in prior assessments and proposed a remediation plan that actually reduced our required reserve by 8%. He paused. "I've been doing this for 3 decades. That's not someone who doesn't know what she's doing." Gordon's face did something complicated. Philip said very carefully, "We have concerns about the authority she has to bind the company without board approval." Tom Garvey looked at me. I opened the folder in front of me. I slid copies across the table. The trust document, the LLC operating agreement, the legal opinion from Gail Marsh confirming my authority to execute on behalf of the operating entity. "The operating agreement is explicit," I said. "Majority interest holder has binding authority for transactions under $100 million This is a $50 million joint venture capitalization. I don't require additional consent. Philip took the documents. He read them. He was very still. Gordon hadn't touched his copy. He was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Tom Garvey looked between them and then back at me. Should we continue? Yes, I said. We should. We broke for lunch at 12:30. The Hargrove and Wells team went to the floor's private dining room. My brothers and I stayed in the conference room. Gordon went first. He leaned across the table and kept his voice low, which was interesting given that he hadn't bothered to do that earlier. You went behind our backs. I used the authority I was given. Dad would never have wanted this. He would have wanted us involved. I looked at him. Dad spent 2 years structuring this trust specifically to give me control. He had every opportunity to structure it differently. He didn't. That was his decision, Gordon, not mine. You manipulated him. I let that one sit in the air between us for a moment. Dad had a mind like a steel trap until his last week of life, I said. You know that. You're saying that because you don't have anything else. Philip cleared his throat. There's still the matter of my service contract. Any restructuring of the operating entity triggers my severance clause. I had been waiting for this. I had Gail's team review that contract. I said, the severance provision is tied to involuntary termination. You haven't been terminated, Philip. The company is restructuring through a joint venture. Your role is continuing. The clause doesn't trigger. He stared at me. I'd have your own attorney review it if you want a second opinion, I said. But I think you'll find the same thing. He knew I was right. I could see it in the way his eyes went flat. Gordon pushed back from the table. I'm calling our attorney. That's your right, I said. The meeting reconvenes at 2 o'clock. He did call an attorney. The attorney reviewed the documents over the phone while Gordon paced the hallway outside. I watched through the glass partition. At 1:55, Gordon came back into the conference room. He sat down. He didn't look at me. At 2 o'clock, Tom Garvey and his team returned. We spent the next 3 hours walking through due diligence timelines, governance structures for the joint venture entity, and the capital deployment schedule for the first phase of development. Gordon sat through all of it in silence. Philip asked 2 technical questions that were genuinely good questions, because whatever else he is, he's not stupid. I answered them both. At 5 o'clock, Tom Garvey stood and shook my hand. We'll have the first round of diligence requests to you by end of week, he said. I'll have the data room ready, I said. My brothers left without saying anything to me. The weeks after that meeting were not peaceful. Gordon hired a litigator, a sharp one, out of a firm in Cleveland, and filed for an emergency injunction to halt the joint venture on the grounds that I had acted outside the scope of my authority. The injunction was denied. The operating agreement was clear. He then filed a separate action challenging the trust structure itself, arguing that my father had lacked the mental capacity to execute the amendments that gave me controlling interest. That one stung, not because it had merit. His own attorney eventually told him it didn't, but because of what it required. My father's medical records, testimony from his doctors, a deposition from Gail Marsh, 12 weeks of my life, on top of managing an active due diligence process with Hargrove and Wells, spent defending my father's mind and his decisions. I got through it the same way I get through most things. I worked, I documented, I kept my communications professional and my emotions private. The case was dismissed with prejudice. The judge's written order included a note that the evidence presented showed no indication of diminished capacity and that the trust documents reflected sophisticated and intentional estate planning. I framed that order. It's hanging in my office. The joint venture closed on a Tuesday in March. $50 million in committed capital. Caldwell Property Group retaining operational control in the Caldwell name. A development pipeline that, if executed, would nearly double the portfolio value within 5 years. I signed the closing documents in Gail Marsh's conference room. She poured 2 glasses of wine when it was done and slid one across the table to me. Your father would be very proud, she said. I didn't trust my voice for a moment, so I just nodded. He'd known, I think, not just that I was capable, but that this would happen. The fight, the injunction, the challenge to his own capacity. He'd known Gordon long enough to see it coming. That's why he'd spent 2 years making the documents airtight. That's why he'd chosen Gail. That's why he'd told me everything in that kitchen, over coffee, with enough time for me to prepare. He'd handed me a fortress. I just had to hold it. Gordon hasn't spoken to me directly since the dismissal. He still receives his income distributions. That part of the trust is untouched, exactly as my father intended. He hired a new attorney, a different one, who sent a letter 3 months ago suggesting we discuss an amicable restructuring of the family business relationship. I had Gail respond professionally that I was open to a meeting when the tone shifted from adversarial to constructive. I haven't heard back. Philip surprised me. About 2 months after the closing, he knocked on my office door. He sat down across from me and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to keep working here. I'm good at this and you know it. I'm not going to pretend what happened was okay, but I'm also not going to keep fighting something that's settled." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the service contract. I thought about the settlement my father had paid to make Philip's earlier mistake go away. I thought about the 12 weeks of litigation I just spent. "Your role is continuing," I said. "Same as I told you in the conference room, but I'm renegotiating your service contract. New terms. Gail's team drafts it. You can have your own attorney review it." He nodded. "Fair." It wasn't warmth. It wasn't reconciliation, exactly. But it was something I could work with. My father believed in the company more than he believed in the conflict, and I think I understand that better now than I did 18 months ago. There's something people don't tell you about winning. It doesn't feel like the movies. There's no moment where the music swells and everyone who doubted you is standing in a row watching you be right. It's mostly just, the work continues. The calls still come in. The due diligence requests pile up. The tenant calls about a broken HVAC unit and you have to get a contractor out there by Friday. But sometimes, late in the day when the office is quiet, I'll pull up the development pipeline on my screen. I'll look at the sites we're evaluating. A mixed-use project in the short north, a logistics facility outside Dayton, a residential conversion downtown that my father had circled in red in his notes years ago and never gotten to. He circled it in red because he wanted to do it someday. I'm going to do it. Not someday. I'm in the early stages of site control right now. He built something real. He trusted me with it. And I'm not going to let a room full of people who underestimated me, or one brother who said I had no business being there, change a single thing about what I know how to do. I stayed silent in that conference room because I didn't need to argue. The document spoke. The track record spoke. Tom Garvey spoke. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is just what preparation looks like from the outside. My father taught me that, and I think about it every single day. I've thought a lot about what Gordon said in that conference room. Not because it hurt me, though it did, in the way that only a sibling's contempt can, cutting somewhere a stranger's cruelty never reaches. I've thought about it because of how certain he was. He genuinely believed every word. That's the part that stays with me. There's something that happens when people are never asked to account for themselves. They start to confuse being unchallenged with being right. Gordon had spent a decade making decisions inside a company our father built, collecting a salary our father funded, and interpreting every year of that as proof of his own capability. He didn't build anything. He maintained what already existed, and not particularly well if you looked at the deferred maintenance reports. But no one had ever put those reports in front of him and asked him to explain them. So he kept walking through the world as the oldest son who ran the family business, and he started to believe the title was the same thing as the competence. I don't say that with contempt. I say it because I think it's one of the most common and most costly mistakes a person can make, letting the absence of consequences become evidence of your own virtue. My father understood this. I think it's why he structured things the way he did. Not to punish Gordon or Philip, but because he'd watched both of them long enough to know that handing them unchecked authority wouldn't serve the company, and it wouldn't serve them either. He gave me control not because I was his favorite, I don't think he thought in those terms, but because he'd watched me do the work when no one was watching. He'd seen me read the leases, ask the hard questions, push back on the contractors. He knew what I was made of because I'd shown him consistently over years in the small moments that don't feel significant until suddenly they're the only thing that matters. That's the thing about preparation. It's invisible until it isn't. When Tom Garvey said what he said, when he quietly, methodically laid out exactly what I had done over those 4 months of negotiation, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that, something closer to relief. Because the work had been real, the hours had been real, and it held up under examination in front of the people whose opinion of it mattered most at exactly the moment when someone was trying to convince the room it didn't exist. Philip came around eventually, not because I was gracious. I don't think gracious is quite the right word for what I offered him. I offered him fairness, a renegotiated contract, a continued role, a clean slate professionally. I did it because it was the right structure for the company and because I think he's genuinely good at the legal work when he's not also trying to protect himself from consequences. People can surprise you when the incentives are honest. Gordon hasn't come around. Maybe he will, eventually. Maybe he won't. I've stopped trying to predict it. What I know is that I'm not waiting for his understanding in order to move forward. The Short North project is in early site control. The Dayton Logistics Facility closes next quarter. The residential conversion my father circled in red is happening. I think the clearest thing I've learned from all of this is that integrity doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates quietly in the record of what you actually did. And when the moment comes, and it always comes, either the record is there or it isn't. You can't manufacture it on the spot. You can't talk your way into it in a conference room when someone challenges you. Either you built something real or you didn't. I built something real, or you didn't. My father saw it before I fully believed it myself, and I'm not done yet.